Arbitration is an agreed-upon procedure between the union and the employer to resolve contractual disputes. And it's very important to remember that, because we can't resolve all disputes at arbitration. They have to come from the contract. If you guys have ever worked at a place that doesn't have a collective bargaining agreement, what you would have found out is that as employees, you don't have any rights, basically. That's kind of the long and the short of it. When you go to an employment situation where you have a contract, you now have rights, but your rights come from the contract. So if it's not in the contract, you don't have it. If it's not in the contract, we can't resolve some issue at an arbitration that doesn't come from our contract. There are basically two types of grievances that get moved through a grievance arbitration procedure. The first one is discipline and discharge cases. Probably the majority of what we see, the majority of what a particular individual might have run into is, they get some kind of trouble, discipline, and they're going to file a grievance about it. The other kind of grievance we have is what's called a contract interpretation grievance. It means that we believe they violated the contract in some other way. It doesn't have to, it doesn't relate to so-and-so got fired or so-and-so got discharged. It might be, you didn't calculate my vacation correctly, and if you look at the contract, it tells you how you have to calculate it. You didn't pay my uniform allowance right, because that's in our contract. It says how you get it. So those are the two types of grievances we have. A grievance starts with a written form. You got to write out, I've been discharged and I believe it for unjust cause, and we get it moved through the process. It's very important when you're getting ready to write a grievance that you talk to your union reps about that, because that becomes the piece of paper that starts the process and is going to be used at the arbitration by the employer to say, well, when you wrote your grievance, you said this is what happened. And now here at the arbitration, you said something else has happened. So they use that, because and you wrote it, close in time to when this event happened. So what we tell the union reps, and we tell any person who will listen to us, when you write a grievance, the less you write, the better. Okay? You don't have to say much. You have to do a few basic things. You have to put the employer on notice about what you're contesting and about when it happened. So, for instance, if somebody got fired, you would say, I believe I was unjustly fired on X and X date. I want to be made whole. You don't have to say anything more than that. Because what that does for us is when we get to the arbitration, we now get to fill in all of the particulars. And the CTA board PACE hasn't really had an opportunity to know what we're going to do. So the less, the better. A lot of times, people want to put down every single provision in the contract that they think was violated, and that can be a problem, because if you put down 10, let's say you mentioned 10 provisions, and then we go through it and we go, yeah, but there's this 11th one here. Now the employer says, but you obviously thought about this. You wrote the 10 that you thought were a problem. Now we had no idea that you thought this was a problem. So the less said, the better. And you can run that through by your union reps. They can help you decide what you need to put in a grievance. The grievance arbitration procedure has, at the CTA, there's 3 steps. At PACE, I think there's about 3, depending on how you look at it. And the point of these steps, the point that is supposed to happen, is that each side, you file a grievance and you get a response. The sides get together and they exchange information and they discuss it, and hopefully they resolve it. And the reason you exchange information is because sometimes the other side doesn't know everything that happened. And that goes both ways. Sometimes from the union standpoint, we have to say, when they give us additional information, you're right, this isn't a violation, we're done with this. On the other hand, the employer should also listen to what happened, and sometimes should adjust the grievance at that second step. Now, in reality, it doesn't happen very well at the CTA. It doesn't happen very well in PACE either. And that's a shame, because if it worked right, we'd have far less arbitrations. And we have a ton of arbitrations. And we have arbitrations when they get to our office and we look at it and we say, this should have been resolved, 8 months ago. Because it's a 2-day suspension that, you make compromises, you say, all right, pay the person a day, maybe you leave it on their record. There's all kinds of ways to resolve it, but it doesn't happen, so we get to arbitration. Now, what happens when you finally get to arbitration is that you have what's called an arbitration hearing. Other than the people that have been involved in a hearing, has anybody ever been involved in giving sworn testimony in court, any place? Anybody? Okay, it's a little like that. It's a little less formal, though. We go into a conference room, and by the time we're there, the union and the employer, the attorneys for those two parties, we've picked what's called an impartial arbitrator. So this is the person that's going to make the decision on whether there was a violation of the contract or not. So as I tell people we're getting ready to go to arbitration, that is the most important person in the room, because that's the person that's going to make the decision. And that's the person that's going to decide, as people testify, and this goes for everybody, whether it's the employer side or our side, this arbitrator is having to watch people and see how they testify, and see if they're credible, and see if they are giving complete and straightforward answers. And again, when we get ready to go to an arbitration, that's what we do with people. We sit down and we talk about that. And we give them examples, and we go through the questions, and we say, it's important that you're respectful of the process, because this arbitrator is going to be deciding whether, if necessary, whether they think a person is telling the truth compared to another person. We usually, almost always, have court reporters, and everybody's sworn to tell the truth, and the court reporter takes down your testimony. And what's important about that, is that sometimes employees have other cases going in other forums. So you got to remember that. So when you're giving your sworn testimony in a CTA proceeding, let's say you have another proceeding against them in the Department of Human Rights or with the EEOC, this is going to be your sworn testimony. They're going to use that maybe later in another proceeding. So it's important to remember that your testimony is being taken down, it's being recorded for ever and ever, for whatever purposes they might use it for. Finally, once the hearing's concluded, usually we write briefs, which is just the lawyer's way of trying to get our final points across to an arbitrator. Say, this is what happened at the hearing. Please look at all this documentation, and when you put it all together, we should win and why we should win. In theory, an arbitrator is supposed to give us a decision in 30 days after that